Hello and welcome to Mythic Mind, where we pursue wisdom on the paths between primary and secondary worlds. I'm Dr. Andrew Snyder, and I'm glad that you're here. Hey there, and welcome back. Before we get into the main topic today, as a reminder, my study on the Elder Scrolls and philosophy begins next week, and it runs for 6 weeks. If you want to participate in that, then all you need to do is head over to patreon.com/mythicmind and become a tier 3 patron, and that'll give you access to the link that is in the pinned post over there. I think it's going to be a really good time. I hope that you'll consider joining us, and if you'd like to check out some of the early content, then make sure that you are subscribed to Mythic Mind Games. Make sure you're subscribed to my YouTube channel. I'm posting some of the introductory content over there, so you can get a taste of some of the things that you can expect. But what I really look forward to is the live meetings in this course. I think they'll be a lot of fun, and I think that they'll be of some value to us. All right, well, for now, we are going to be continuing with the Fiction and Philosophy of C.S. Lewis, which is a course that I ran in the summer of 2024. And today we'll be looking at part 1 of Till We Have Faces. I hope you enjoy. Hello, welcome back as we dig into Till We Have Faces, Book 1. Now, this is going to be a little bit of a different kind of lesson, different kind of presentation than I've been doing recently. Especially for That Hideous Strength, I was able to go more or less chapter by chapter because of how we broke it up. Now, even though Till We Have Faces is a significantly shorter book than that, there's just so much packed in here. It's such a sophisticated story. There is so much that Lewis is giving us. And the fact that, as I mentioned last time, that of all of Lewis's stories, this is the one that most takes on that idea of myth, which means it's not overly didactic. You don't have any characters. At least you don't typically have a central character who comes out and says exactly what Lewis wants you to take away. It's more of you're entering into the dark places, the holy places. You're entering into a place where reason has a difficult time orienting itself appropriately. And so what that means is there is a lot that we can take from this, a lot of different angles that we can use, different lenses, all of which might be justified. Now, I mean, obviously, there are ways that you can go wrong in interpreting anything, and so I don't mean to suggest that anything goes, but a lot of things can go simultaneously, and I think that that's something that Lewis would absolutely have us discover as we approach this text. And so, if there's interest, maybe at some point in the future, we'll do just a full study just of this text, looking at the different character developments, the different thematic developments, looking at the slow death of Orual throughout Book 1, and obviously where that goes into Book 2, looking at the different philosophers that the Fox quotes on a fairly regular basis, as he references the Greeks, as he references the poets, the philosophers. We even get a direct quotation from Marcus Aurelius' Meditations. And so I think that could make for, I think, just a really profitable study at some point. But for now, the way that we're going to do this is I'm going to track some of the main characters, the main voices surrounding Orual. And we're actually going to talk relatively little about Orual herself in this presentation. Now, we will get to her at the end, but I'm going to focus more on the external factors that kind of set boundaries for her, psyche, I guess, to use a loaded term here. And that's because for Book 1, she doesn't have a face. That the main theme here is that she doesn't have any sense of selfhood, that she's constantly trying to define herself by external things that are never really her own, because she refuses to give herself to them, especially to give herself over to love, the real ideal of love. And so she's constantly trying to hide from herself, get away from herself, hence the veil that she wears for much of the story. And so because Psyche really isn't a character, right? That's the theme, that she isn't a self. We're going to be focusing on the external influences that seem to define her life. But we are going to start by taking a brief look at Orual as our narrator. And as I've mentioned in the last video, she's not entirely a reliable narrator. She definitely has an axe to grind, and in fact, she comes out very clear about this, that she's writing her case against the gods. And so this is not an impersonal, objective biography by any means. Now, she starts off saying, "I am old now, and have not much to fear from the anger of gods. I have no husband, nor child, nor hardly a friend, through whom they can hurt me." Now, I've already mentioned that there is a connection between Till We Have Faces and Lewis's The Four Loves, and we actually see that play out right here in the opening lines of the story. And so she has not much to fear from the anger of the gods, and so she has a falling out with the gods. So here we see a misrelation to agape love, or I guess a failure to appropriate, to receive agape, godly love. This is the love that God gives us not because he needs us, but simply out of an abundance of grace. This is gift love. This is selfless love. And this, of course, is the chief love in Lewis's paradigm. And as we saw in the Ransom series, when you get the order wrong, when you place a lesser good in the place of the greater good, then all goods start to take a demonic form. They start to take a perverted, a bent form. And so because she doesn't have a right relationship with God, she has not received agape love, everything else kind of falls apart. And so she has no husband, no child. And so she doesn't know agape love, or charity, to use Lewis's word actually. And so she doesn't know charity, she doesn't know eros, she doesn't know affection, she doesn't know friendship. These are the four loves that Lewis discusses in his book. And so she doesn't have any of this. She is alone. She is radically isolated. And as we're going to see, she's radically isolated, not just because she's been dealt such a bad hand, but she's isolated because she has chosen isolation. She has refused to give herself away, and in so doing, she has ended up actually losing herself. Because the thing is that you are always going to lose yourself. The question is, do you do it willingly with the faith that you will gain yourself back anew, or do you lose yourself by trying to hold on to yourself so tightly? And in so doing, you're grabbing at vapor, at hevel, you're chasing after the wind, which is, of course, a fool's errand, and will leave you empty. It will leave you an unintegrated self. It will leave you faceless. And so because she doesn't have a rightly ordered love, the potential loves that she does have take on a demonic flair to them, as Lewis says happens in The Four Loves. And we get this statement not long after Psyche's birth, where Orual says, "I wanted to be a wife so that I could have been her real mother. I wanted to be a boy so that she could be in love with me. I wanted her to be my full sister instead of my half-sister. I wanted her to be a slave so that I could set her free and make her rich." And so Orual gains this all-consuming sense of love for Psyche. And I say sense of love because Orual is convinced that it is genuine love, that she's just enraptured with the beauty and with the goodness of her sister Psyche. However, notice in all of these statements, they're self-referential, right? She loves Psyche, not because she wants to give herself over to Psyche, not because she wants Psyche to have the best possible life and to know the greatest delights and the greatest joy. No, all of her so-called loves for Psyche are aimed at Orual, at her role, at what she is able to receive from loving Psyche. And we're going to come back to some of this when we get to the Great Divorce, because when we see those examples of some of the people that are in hell because of their disordered loves, we're going to see some good examples of Orual in that text. And so I think that'll be a good follow-up here, but I guess I'll just leave that sit here for now. But some of you might already have some of those images coming to mind if you are familiar with that book. And so, as Lewis says, "For natural loves that are allowed to become gods do not remain loves. They are still called so, but can become, in fact, complicated forms of hatred." And that's a theme that we're going to see play out later on. And you can think about when Psyche isn't willing to come back with Orual, and Orual says that, okay, because I love you so much, I'm going to kill you and then myself. Obviously not exactly an ideal manifestation of true love. We see something perverted, something corrupted. We see hatred that's simply wearing the guise of love. And not only does Orual truly hate Psyche by not desiring her good, but she even hates herself. And that's because she really isn't a self. She is an emptiness. She is a void. She is as formless and as consuming as that rock of Unget presents itself to her. She is the perverted, the inverted feminine ideal. Speaking of which, Our first character study is actually going to be of Ungit. The god of the Grey Mountain, who hates me, is the son of Ungit. He does not, however, live in the house of Ungit, but Ungit sits there alone. In the furthest recess of her house, where she sits, it is so dark that you cannot see her well. But in summer, enough light may come down from the smoke holes in the roof to show her a little. She is a black stone without head or hands or face, and a very strong goddess. My old master, whom we called the Fox, said that she was the same who the Greeks called Aphrodite. But I write all the names of people and places in our own language. And so, Ungit is Aphrodite, also known as Venus, or as known to us by now, Paralandra. However, in all the interactions in Book 1 that Orual has with Ungit, she doesn't take the form of the blessed heavenly intelligence Paralandra. She takes the form of really just this consuming monster in a very real sense, in a very mysterious sense, a sense that we're going to dig into in Book 2. Orual is Ungit. Ungit is Orual, or at least Ungit, as she presents herself to Orual in Book 1, is Orual. And remember in That Hideous Strength, when Jane, toward the end of the book, she receives this vision of Venus, or as Ransom says, the Wraith of Venus. But he says that the way that she presents herself as being kind of like Mother Dimple, but not exactly, and really more terrifying, more off-putting, more distasteful to Jane. Ransom says that this is the unbaptized version of Venus. This is the feminine ideal not brought within the proper order of deep heaven, where the Paralandra of deep heaven, the Paralandra in proper Christian order, is that which receives the masculine and gives rise to new life. However, the more wild, the more disorderly wraith of Venus, it can easily turn into simply that which doesn't receive, but that which consumes. Again, to the Great Divorce, if you've already read that story, and we'll talk about it when we get there, but think of that mother who had this consuming appearance of love for her son, who really just devoured him. And you only have to go to the Great Divorce, right? You could think of a host of classic fairy tales, Grimm fairy tales. Hansel and Gretel, the witch, is the consuming mother who fattens up their child with delights and with confectionaries. He just gives him everything that he could possibly want. And then as he becomes ripe, he's not becoming stronger, he's not becoming healthier, he's not becoming better able to engage with the world appropriately. No, he's becoming better fit for her consumption. And that is the devouring mother motif. That is the terror that Ungit can become. And that Ungit, which Orual obviously hates, which Orual obviously willingly does not understand, that is who Orual is. And the reason why Orual can't understand Ungit, the reason why Orual hates Ungit, is because Orual refuses to understand herself. And because, as I already mentioned, Orual hates herself. And so the faceless Ungit very much is the faceless Orual. She is the all-consuming, disordered feminine. And I think it's looking at this little story that the Fox gives of Aphrodite. Then he deepened and lifted his voice, and told how their Aphrodite once fell in love with the prince Anchises, while he kept his father's sheep on the slope of a mountain called Ida. And as she came down the grassy slopes toward the shepherd's hut, lions and lynxes and bears and all sorts of beasts came about her, fawning like dogs, and all went from her again in pairs to the delights of love. But she dimmed her glory, and made herself like a mortal woman, and came to Anchises, and beguiled him, and they went up together into his bed. I think the Fox meant to end here, but the song now had him in its grip, and he went on to tell what followed, how Anchises woke from sleep and saw Aphrodite standing in the door of the hut, not now like a mortal, but with the glory. So he knew he had lain with a goddess, and he covered his eyes and shrieked, "Kill me at once." Not that this really happened, the Fox said in haste. It's only the lies of poets, child, not in accordance with nature. But he had said enough to let me see that if the goddess was more beautiful in Greece than in Glome, she was equally terrible in each. Now first, on a positive note, this should remind us of what we saw at the end of That Hideous Strength, that when Aphrodite, when Venus, when Paralandra draws near, and all the animals, they start to pair up. She is the influence of love, and so nature is coming together in her presence. But she joins herself with this mortal, and when he recognizes what happened, he is ashamed, he is horrified. And on one hand, you might think that he would wake up and say, "Oh, wow, I've been with a goddess. What delight, lucky me." But no, he's mortified because he recognizes that he had no place here. He had no place in relation with Venus. And so even though we don't see here that she's necessarily doing anything to harm him, simply her presence becomes this consuming force because things are out of order here. He recognizes that this is not his station. And it reminds me of what we see later when Psyche says that she was ashamed of her mortality in relation to her immortal husband, her bridegroom. However, that shame gets transmuted into glory in Psyche's case. That Psyche, soul, meets with Eros, with Cupid, with love. And so soul meets with love, and we don't see that her soul, that her Psyche, is destroyed. She's not given over to despair, but she is actually uplifted. Her soul is made to be at home with the gods. And Psyche also says, if dreams were to be walking about in the waking world, would they not also be ashamed of their illusory nature? So too, she is a dream brought up into a greater divine reality. But she isn't actually ashamed. She is made to be real. She is the dream come to reality. She is the shadow brought up into substance. She is the shade, the ghost that becomes substantial. But this right here gives us that theme here of that disconnect of the ontological, or the difference in being between a god and a mortal, between the more substantial and the less substantial. But in the case of this story that the fox gives us, the man is consumed by what presents itself as this consuming goddess. But in Psyche's case, she is consumed by love in a way that actually makes her more real. It's something, there is this connection between the consuming and the loving, between the giving over and receiving back. And that's something that we're going to see later on, that all these ideas get wrapped up together, these seemingly competing ideas. That on one hand, she's going to be consumed by a brute, but the other hand, she's going to be marrying a god. And that these different ways of speaking speak to simultaneously the same reality. And we can understand this if we consider Eucharistic language. And so on one hand, we consume the elements, we consume the body and blood of Christ, and in so doing, we ourselves are consumed. We are brought into who Christ is. We are laying ourselves down with the hope that we will be raised up again. And so we are consumed, we are also made more ourselves. We are joining with the accursed, and we are also joining with the beloved. And so all of these things get wrapped up together, different ways of looking at the same reality. And I think that's what's going on here with a lot of this paradoxical, mysterious language. Now, we see pretty early on that while the fox just thought that the whole Ungit cult was nonsense, right? It's the lies of poets. Whereas Orual seems to actually believe that there is some kind of reality to the gods, and she hates it. She doesn't like it. And so the fox doesn't understand it. Orual doesn't want to understand it. And so she treats holiness, or she portrays holiness as this smell. It's the blood, it's the sacrifice, it's darkness, it's that which it is not pleasant to enter into. It's the Ungit smell. And so this is how she portrays holiness. This is how she portrays the culture of the gods. However, despite the fact that Ungit's rock is faceless, is kind of amorphous, kind of this blob, is just sort of this consuming presence that Orual detests, we see that the people think of Ungit herself as being extraordinarily beautiful, right? She is Aphrodite. She is Venus. And we see this when the crowds think that Psyche might even be Ungit in mortal shape. And so this shows us the two different sides of Ungit. On one hand, you have the consuming feminine that simply absorbs, devours the sacrifice. But on the other hand, Ungit is also the more positive feminine, that which is beautiful, that which draws attention toward goodness, that which produces life. And that's why Psyche gets associated with Ungit, for better or for worse. And so Ungit can be that which devours. It can also be that which brings about life, that which loves and gives itself over. And so both of these dynamics are at play in Ungit. And this connects to the medieval view of the cosmos that we've been discussing. Remember that Venus, even though Venus herself might be good, her influence can manifest itself in different ways depending on how you are relating yourself to Venus. And so it can take on a more positive demeanor, it can take on a more negative demeanor. And even the negative demeanor might actually be good when it's phrased in the appropriate context. And so it's all about how we are relating ourselves to this influence and how we are incorporating it into our psyche, into our soul. Now, one thing I think is interesting here is that when the priest is talking to the king and he's listing off all the woes that the kingdom has befallen, he says, "And lastly, king, your own barrenness of sons, which is hateful to Ungit." And so we see that the barrenness of the king is, to some degree, his fault. Or at least the way that this is coming across the fact that because he did something wrong, Ungit is upset with him. And the king responds to this as we might be inclined to do. He says, "Hateful to Ungit, is it? Why does Ungit not mend it then? She's had bulls and rams and goats from me in plenty, blood enough to sail a ship on, if it were reckoned." So we get the sense that we got from the prophets, that Ungit doesn't necessarily desire the blood of bulls and goats. That's not what the sacrifices are really meant to be about if the king's heart is not in the right place. And so we see that the king, I think, has a misrelation to Ungit, a misrelation to Venus, a misrelation to the feminine. And that's not a point that's very difficult to argue if you've read the story. We see how he treats Orual, even how he treats beloved Psyche. When the priest says that she is the accursed, she's the one that must be sacrificed, he's relieved just because it's not him. And so we get this idea here that he doesn't care a great deal about women in general. In fact, we see how he treats the maids. We're told he has all kinds of illegitimate children because, well, he just kind of takes whatever he wants. Now, Bardia does say that he does pretty well with the men. He's good on a hunt. He's good with the lions. He's good in war. He's good to the soldiers. He's good to the guards. He's kind of one of the men, and he gets along with them quite well. And so while he might get along with the martial spirit, more or less, he doesn't have a proper relationship to Venus, a proper relationship to Ungit. And so perhaps the barrenness that is hateful to Ungit, it's symbolic or it's representative of the misrelation to Ungit that the king has. He doesn't have a proper relation to the feminine, and what that means is he's not able to produce new life, because that's not something that the masculine can do on its own. The masculine is meant to give itself over in service to the feminine, use its strength for her honor and for her virtue, and in so doing, she then receives the masculine and then gives rise to new life. But that's not happening, at least not in the way that the king wants, not in the way that the king should have happened. And so his barrenness of sons at least, is symbolic of this misrelation that he has. And so on one hand, you might say that the barrenness is a curse of Ungit, but it's a self-induced curse. And so I think that's interesting here. Now, I've already talked about this beloved and accursed language. It's a both and. It's that this is going to be in a kind of atonement offering, while at the same time, it's a marriage of the best that they have to offer. And so it is simultaneously the best, simultaneously the worst. And of course, we see that Lewis's Christianity here is shining through in the way that he's contextualizing all this. In fact, he notes that one of the things that he thinks the original myth got wrong or didn't kind of go far enough in emphasizing is this idea of sacrifice. You go back to the old myth that he's riffing off of, and we do get this idea that Psyche is going to wed the shadow brute, or going to wed the monster, but the idea of sacrifice itself is not really a clear concept in the original myth, and so this is something that Lewis is contributing here, that it is both a wedding and it is a sacrifice, as a form of appeasement. And that makes more sense out of the kind of why she would be handed over to a monster. I think this passage here is worth reading. The victim must be given to the brute, for the brute is a mystery, Ungit herself, or Ungit's son, the god of the mountain, or both. The victim is led up the mountain to the holy tree, and bound to the tree and left. Then the brute comes. This is why you angered Ungit just now, king, when you spoke of offering a thief. In the great offering, the victim must be perfect, for in holy language, a man so offered is said to be Ungit's husband, and a woman is said to be the bride of Ungit's son, and both are called the brute's supper. And when the brute is Ungit, it lies with the man, and when it is her son, it lies with the woman. And either way, there is a devouring. Many different things are said, many sacred stories, many great mysteries. Some say the loving and the devouring are all the same thing. For in sacred language, we say that a woman who lies with the man devours the man. That is why you are so wide of the mark, king, when you think a thief, or an old worn-out slave, or a coward taken in battle would do for the great offering. The best in the land is not too good for this office. And I appreciate that this isn't this language of devouring and loving kind of being one and the same. This is not just for this religious ceremony. He says this relates to men and women in general, that the love is a kind of devouring. And I think that it speaks to this idea that if the masculine is going to play its role appropriately, it needs to give itself over to the feminine. It needs to lay itself down, use its strength in service, even be willing to die, as Ransom did, this agent of Malacandra, this agent of Mars, as he went under the earth of Paralandra, that he laid himself down. He had a kind of death, and in his death in the ground of Venus, new life sprang forward, and he in turn became more of himself. So too, in sacred language, a woman devours the man and then gives rise to new life. And in the right kind of devouring, he also is becoming part of love, and he emerges from this kind of death stronger and more himself, and with some progeny beside him. And so I think that Lewis is really doing something sophisticated here on a philosophical level regarding the masculine and feminine, as well as on a mythological level, and also even on a psychological and marital level, that he's really giving us this idea that we saw in the Ransom series through the dialectic of Mars to Venus, and then kind of how that feeds into life on Earth through Mark and Jane. He's really giving us this idea that the masculine uses its strength to lay itself down into the feminine, and then in so doing, the feminine is able to produce new life, and the masculine becomes even more of itself. And so I think that that's exactly what we see playing out here. Now, also, I mean, I already mentioned, and I'm sure that I don't really need to mention the fact that there are some strong Christian overtones to the way that Lewis is framing this. We see that Psyche is going to be led up to the holy tree, obviously pointing us to the cross. Now, that being said, Lewis is very clear in one of his letters that Psyche is not Christ. However, there are these Christological themes that kind of run all throughout. And so he's not telling us this is that, but we do just have this sense of the gospel that's pervading this, a sense of holiness, as he says, pervades the works of George MacDonald. He said this one thing that he likes about MacDonald. It gives him this sense of holiness without hitting anything on the nose. Now, also notice that there is some differentiation, but not complete differentiation, between Ungit and Ungit's son, between Venus and Cupid, we might say. Later on, I can't remember who says it, but I think it's in this presentation. It said that the gods sort of dwell within each other, and so there's a kind of common nature that they all share. I think of in the Ransom series, in That Hideous Strength, Ransom says that all of the gods are represented within each other. And so the divine nature has this unity to it, even with distinction, even with differentiation. Now, I don't think that we want to make a one-to-one connection to the Trinity, but I do think that there are certain themes at play here that would at least move us in that direction without having a one-to-one allegorical theology here. Now, this language, specifically of the masculine laying itself down for the feminine, as well as the role that Psyche is playing in taking a kind of Christological position herself, it makes me think of this quote from Mere Christianity right at the end. "Nothing in you that has not died will ever be erased from the dead. Look for yourself, and you will find in the long run hatred, loneliness, despair, rage, ruin, and decay. But look for Christ, and you will find him, and with him everything else thrown in." And so as long as you are trying to hold on to your identity, trying to hold it with a closed hand, never letting yourself be taken in, and never letting yourself go out, you're going to find in the end that you have lost yourself. In fact, worse yet, perhaps, you've never actually been a self. You've been a person without a face. Whereas If you are willing to lay yourself down, you're willing to enter into the broader context. You're willing to become more real. You're willing to forsake your shadow existence for substance. Well, then you'll actually be that. You will be substantial. And I think that theme runs along with this whole idea of sacrifice. That even though Psyche at this point, she doesn't really know what's going to happen, but she's willing to go through the sacrifice because she knows that in the end, it's going to be good, whatever it is that goodness actually is, whatever the good looks like. And so she's willing to do that, and in so doing, she's going to become more herself, more of a properly ordered psyche, a properly ordered soul. Now, when the king provides some pushback to the priest gives this great line. He says, "Holy places are dark places. It is life and strength, not knowledge and words, that we get in them. Holy wisdom is not clear and thin like water, but thick and dark like blood. Why should the accursed not be both the best and the worst?" And so this is what the fox rejects as nonsense because he can't understand it. He wants to domesticate everything. He wants to bring everything under his control. And so he's not willing to engage with this. Orual really wants to do much the same thing. And so on one hand, unlike the fox, she seems to believe in some reality of the gods, but she doesn't want to. She doesn't want to engage with them because, as with the fox, she can't domesticate this. She can't understand it. And so because she can't understand it, she rejects it. She's unwilling to become vulnerable. And remember what that means, looking back to the quote from the Four Loves at the beginning of this presentation. She refuses to be vulnerable. She refuses to show her face. And so she continually recoils away into that which she can understand. However, by latching onto her finite understanding, she really ends up losing even that. She falls into the same mistake of the fox in having reason without root. She rejects the very dark soil that she stands on. And we'll come back to that imagery in just a little bit. Actually, we'll come back to it right here. And so in this scene, Psyche is imprisoned. She's under guard from Bardia. And Orual was just let in, and so they're having this conversation before the sacrifice. And Psyche says, "The priest has been with me. I never knew him before. He is not what the fox thinks. Do you know, sister, I have come to feel more and more that the fox hasn't the whole truth. Oh, he has much of it. It'd be dark as a dungeon within me, but for his teaching. And yet, I can't say it properly. He calls the whole world a city, but what's a city built on? There's earth beneath, and outside the wall? Doesn't all the food come from there, as well as all the dangers? Things growing and rotting, strengthening and poisoning. Things shining wet. In one way, I don't know which way. More like, yes, even more like the house of, yes, of Ungut," said I. "Doesn't the whole land smell of her? Do you and I need to flatter gods any more? They're tearing us apart. Oh, how shall I bear it? And what worse can they do? Of course the fox is wrong. He knows nothing about her." This is actually one of my favorite passages, probably top 5 or so, easily top 10. And it speaks to a major theme in this story. And so Psyche says that the fox says that the whole world is like a city. And this is a very Greek idea. So Aristotle says famously that man is the rational animal, which means that we're able to use reason to think abstractly. We can think about concepts. We can think about potential realities, and we can decide which of those realities ought to be actualized. And what that means is that not only are we the rational animal, but he goes on to say in the Nicomachean Ethics that we are the ethical animal, which means we're able to differentiate between good and bad, better and worse. Now, because we are the rational animal and we're capable of abstract knowledge and we're able to engage in ethical reasoning, he also says that we are the political animal. It's one of the ways that he defines humanity, because we are able to come together to use reasoned discourse to determine what the best course of action is and how to go about actualizing it. And so with this understanding of humanity, we are all citizens of one city, and we have a responsibility to come together and to build up the structure that we live in. In fact, not only do we have a responsibility to do that, but that's just what we do by default. What we have a responsibility to do is to do that well. And so for the fox, all people are part of a city, and that is the best way to understand the world from the viewpoint of human experience. And Psyche points out something very significant here. She says that, okay, maybe he has a point to a degree. However, a city is built on the ground. It's built on the soil. And the soil is not manufactured by the city. It came there. It was there before the city. In fact, it was there before any of us were. And so the question is, what is this which is most natural? That which our reasoning is based on? Where does our reason come from? Our power to reason? There's something beneath all of that. There's something beneath all of our reasoning that reason itself cannot account for. And this has some precedence in Greek thought, especially in Plato, when Plato says that the highest reality, the good, is not something that we can apprehend by reason, but is that by which we reason. This is why in his allegory of the cave, the good is represented by the sun. And you don't study the sun by looking at it directly. If you do that, you go blind. You study the sun by looking at its effects. Or better yet, you study the sun really not by studying it at all. You learn more about the sun simply by seeing clearly that which it illuminates. And so you don't see the light, you see by the light. And for more on this, make sure you look at Lewis's short story, A Man Born Blind, I think it's called. But it's in that collection of The Dark Tower and other stories. And so make sure you take a look at that. It really gets to this point well. But nonetheless, Psyche is pointing to the fact that reason cannot domesticate that by which we reason. There's something underneath all of it. And whatever it is that's underneath all of that, that which reason cannot account for, is best understood as the religious. This is the domain of the gods, right? It's not something that we see through the clear water of reason, but it's the dark blood that the priest is talking about. It's that in which we find power and wisdom, but it's not something that we can comprehend. It's not something that we can domesticate. It's something that we need to enter into and be consumed by. And in so doing, we might find that we ourselves are consuming wisdom and power and strength. I think of that quote from George MacDonald when he says that the philosopher lives in the thought of things, whereas the Christian lives in the things themselves. And I think that speaks well to what Psyche is bringing out here. Now we get some more insight into Ungit here when Psyche is passing the house of Ungit, and we get some discussion of the shape. We're told that it looks like an egg, or the priest says that it really is an egg. In fact, maybe even the egg from which the whole world was hatched, or the womb in which the whole world once lay. And so this is the egg of the world. And to bring it into biblical creation account, we see that God created out of nothingness. And so nothingness has a kind of feminine quality to it. God obviously has a masculine quality. This is why Ransom said that there is something above us so masculine that everything else seems feminine in relation to it, right? God is the ultimate masculine. Nothingness has a kind of femininity in relation to God because it is able to receive the active word of God. And in receiving this word of God, it then gives rise to new life. It becomes that which is. And so the soil itself has a kind of feminine quality to it as well, right? A seed is planted in the soil. It goes down into the soil and it dies. And as it dies in the soil, it gives rise to new life. And so this is a theme that we see throughout nature. This idea of death and rebirth is a theme that we see throughout pagan mythologies. It's something that we see most clearly and particularly in the gospel. As Christ enters into death, which receives him and then gives rise to life. Christ is laid into the earth, he's laid into his tomb, and then he comes forth in new life. And so, nothingness has a kind of feminine relation to God. The earth has a kind of feminine relation to a seed. Even death itself has a kind of feminine relation to Christ. And so this is something that we see throughout the very fibers of existence, the very fibers of creation, as well as in the Christian theology of salvation. And for more on this, take a look at Lewis's essay, Myth Became Fact, which we'll be discussing in the next video. But I do think this is interesting here, that Ungit, who symbolizes the feminine, is housed within the egg of the whole world. And so this is going to be a very significant theme, especially when we get to book 2. The idea that even the earth itself has a certain feminine quality to it, a certain relation to the feminine ideal, as that which receives and then gives rise to new life. Now, the worship of Ungit takes a different form, a more sophisticated, a more Hellenistic form, under the next priest, Arnhem. Arnhem's been speaking with the fox, and so he starts to introduce more philosophical language into the cult of Ungit. He sanitizes things, he starts cleaning up more after the sacrifices, he gets rid of the Ungit smell, and perhaps most significantly, he introduces a new image of Ungit, a woman-shaped image in the Greek fashion, in front of the old, shapeless stone. On one hand, this looks a lot nicer, it's more inviting, but I think that Lewis would have us see this as a digression rather than a progression. It looks like progress, but really what we're doing is we're moving into the domesticated world of rational philosophy. We're moving into the world of appearances, and we're losing the darkness. We're losing the thing itself in favor of the appearance that we like. But despite this desire to come up with a more sophisticated religion, the old Ungit is still there. The old Ungit is always there. Ungit is who she is, regardless of the changing times. All right, now let's talk a little bit about the fox. Now, he's obviously this very rational Greek thinker. Perhaps most significantly, he draws from Stoicism. But even that isn't necessarily the real him. It's a significant part of him, to be sure, but he's more of a poet than he wants to recognize. It was always like that with the fox. He was ashamed of loving poetry. All folly, child. And I had to work much at my reading and writing in what he called philosophy in order to get a poem out of him. And so he has this attraction to poetry, which he calls all lies, all folly, child. And then we see that at the end of his life, he starts giving himself over to more poetry. And so the fox has this sense that his rational philosophy is not all that there is good to be found elsewhere in other sources, in the lies of the poets, or the supposed lies of the poets. And so he too has a kind of mask up. He has a kind of veil that he is willingly wearing in order to hide from realities that he can't fully domesticate. But instead of trying too hard to get into the real fox, I think we should probably just focus on the fox as he presents himself, because that's going to be most significant for Orual. So he says a few times in a few different ways, "We must learn, child, not to fear anything that nature brings," he whispered back. And so he was a Stoic, right? The Stoics believed that fate simply is what it is. It's not our job to proactively shape destiny. Our job really is to let go, to simply accept whatever may come, whatever fate has destined for us, and to not let it carry us away, to not give over to our passions, not give over to our emotions, but simply stand solid, because that is freedom. Freedom is in relating ourselves positively to fate and not giving over to anxiety, because anxiety is going to wrap us up in emotional reactions, which aren't actually going to do anything at all from the Stoic perspective. And so freedom for the Stoic is simply embracing fate and detaching yourself from any sense of possession of things that you never actually possessed. And so if you read Epictetus, you read Zeno, you read these Greek and Roman Stoics, they're going to tell you things like, don't become overly attached to possessions. And we might look at that and say, that's a good thing. But they're also going to say, don't become overly attached to even relationships, to your own family, because these things can be taken away at a whim, at the whim of destiny, if even that's a bit of an oxymoron to say with that statement. But don't attach yourself to anything, simply accept whatever nature brings your way. And so he very much plays the Stoic, even if he's a little inconsistent with that from time to time. Now, I think that is worth talking about how he understands Psyche, because that speaks to his broader philosophy as well. And so most people look at Psyche and they think that she's some kind of god, or she's at least blessed by the gods. She has some kind of divine quality about her. But the fox says that she is rather according to nature, what every woman, or even everything, ought to have been and meant to be, but had missed by some trip of chance. And so as something of a materialist, something of a naturalist, the fox sees Psyche as the perfection of form, that she is the fulfillment of form. She is what everybody should be when nature is brought up to its peak. And so she is simply the best that there could be from a natural understanding of things. But she dismisses all this language of the gods. Instead, he speaks of the divine nature, which is a fairly common way of this that the Stoics would refer to as fate or as logos. Logos being wisdom, the reason embedded in reality, which should not be understood as some kind of transcendent God distinct from material reality, but it is the reason that is embedded in material reality. This is as close as we get to divinity. Reason that is embedded in natural reality. And something that's embedded in natural reality isn't really personal, and so it's not going to be jealous. It's not really concerned about us. It simply is what it is. And according to the fox, the best thing that we can do, the most pious thing perhaps, would be simply to accept the divine nature, but not to be concerned about any kind of poetic anthropomorphisms. And this is, again, is the fox talking about how the priest seems to be speaking nonsense about a god who's a shadow brute who's going to consume the accursed, but also marry a bride. And he says it just doesn't make sense. It's illogical. It's irrational. And so it doesn't fit within the fox's domesticated worldview. Now, again, going to Orual and Psyche speaking before the sacrifice, Psyche says, "You make me think I have learned the fox's lessons better than you. Have you forgotten what we are to say to ourselves every morning? Today I shall meet cruel men, cowards and liars, the envious and the drunken. They will be like that, because they do not know what is good from what is bad. This is an evil which has fallen upon them, not upon me. They are to be pitied, not—" She was speaking with a loving mimicry of the fox's voice. She could do this well as Bada did it badly. Now, I bring this up just to show you that in Psyche's quotation of the fox, we see that the fox was directly, word for word, quoting Marcus Aurelius' Meditations, Marcus Aurelius being the great Roman emperor and Stoic philosopher. And by the way, if you've never read Marcus Aurelius' Meditations, I'd recommend doing so. You can probably find a copy online, or even better yet, not too difficult to find in any bookstore or on Amazon. It's worth reading. I mean, obviously, it's not a Christian text, but the early Christians saw a lot of value in the Stoics, and I think that there's a lot there that we can learn from about how to be steadfast amidst a changing world. But anyways, I just bring this up to show you that the fox is directly pulling from the Stoic emperor Marcus Aurelius. And then, as he grew older, he seemed to be ever less and less a philosopher, and to talk more of eloquence and figures and poetry. And so in his old age, he moves away from reason, and he moves into poetry. He moves into more of a religious kind of orientation to reality. Makes me think of Thomas Aquinas. Famously, Thomas Aquinas obviously developed this very complex, rational Christian philosophy. But then toward the end of his life, he has some kind of mystical experience with Christ, and then he walks away saying that everything that he's produced has been but straw. And so that doesn't mean he's necessarily discounting everything he said. He's just simply saying that what he provided, that his teaching is as nothing compared to the reality that he's been pursuing, and that now he's apparently had some kind of taste of. And, you know, I can look at my own life. I mean, I'm not that old right now, but I can see that how earlier in my life, in my early 20s, in my teenage years, I had much more of a rationalistic philosophy I do now. But you know, as I've lived more, as I've known more loss, more heartache, as well as more good things, I've been given over a lot more to poetry and to literature and things that speak to my soul. That doesn't mean that we discount reason, but I think that this is a natural and a good kind of development that we see taking place in the fox. And in fact, he starts to get very confused, and sometimes he'll refer to Orual as Psyche. And I almost wonder if in this new poetic, maybe even semi-prophetic state that the fox is entering into, regardless of what might be going on in his head, if this is a reiteration of what the god told Orual, that she also will be Psyche. Now we have the fox here at the end of his life given over to poetry, a more religious way of thinking, and he's starting to call Orual Psyche from time to time. I just at very least find that interesting. All right, now Psyche. Of Psyche's beauty, at every age, the beauty proper to that age, there's only this to be said, that there were no two opinions about it, for man or woman. Once she had been seen. It was beauty that did not astonish you till afterwards, when you had gone out of sight of her and reflected on it. While she was with you, you were not astonished. It seemed the most natural thing in the world. As the fox delighted to say, she was, according to nature, what every woman or even everything ought to have been, and meant to be, but had missed by some trip of chance. Indeed, when you looked at her you believed for a moment that they had not missed it. She made beauty all around her. When she trod on mud, the mud was beautiful. When she ran in the rain was silver. When she picked up a toad, she had the strangest, and I thought unchanciest love for all manners of brutes. The toad became beautiful. And so she is true beauty. And let's break this down a little bit. We're told that it was a beauty that did not astonish you till afterwards, when you had gone out of sight of her and reflected on it. And this reminds me of what Hoy and Ransom were talking about in Out of the Silent Planet, when Hoy says that pleasure is not best experienced in the moment, but it begins in the moment, and then it reaches its maturation after the moment's passed, as you're dwelling on it, reflecting on it, writing poetry on it. And I think that theme is coming out here, that she has a kind of beauty that astonishes you even more so as you think back on it. And so this continues this idea that pleasure is meant to not be this instantaneous, momentary thing, but that pleasure is something that simmers and it even grows over time, moving you closer and closer into a state of being rather than just experiencing a momentary becoming. And so she has that kind of beauty that raises you up and over time moves you more and more into a good state of being, the realm of beauty itself. I've already referenced this section from the Fox, that she is according to nature. She is the actualized potential of at least the feminine, or perhaps even everything itself. And remember, as Ransom says, that everything, at least every created thing, is itself feminine in relation to the ultimate masculine that is above everything else. And so, in a certain sense, if she is the ideal feminine, then she's also the ideal of everything, or at least all of created contingent reality. And she not only is beautiful herself, but she makes things beautiful. When she walks in the mud, she makes the mud beautiful. Same with the rain. She makes a toad beautiful. And this gives us the image of, the princess who kisses the toad and then transforms him into his potential as this handsome prince, as this handsome man. And so beauty makes other things beautiful. Beauty summons reality around it up in the chain of being toward that which is true and toward that which is good. She brings the great dance with her and invites everything around her to take its right step in that order. This is the story of Beauty and the Beast. And in fact, maybe this is also the story of Psyche and Orual by the time we reach the end. And so we see that Psyche has this sacrificial tendency to her. She's willing to lay herself down to give herself away for others. And so she goes around touching people who are sick. And it says that only the gods know if those who recovered were those whom Psyche had touched, and gods did not tell. And so it's not clear if any kind of power or whatever is coming through Psyche, but what we see most importantly is her character, that she's willing to risk bearing their infirmities so that they would be made well. She's willing to receive the sickness into her that she might produce new life. Now we got a good foreshadowing here, where Orual goes into the room with Psyche before her sacrifice, and Psyche sat upon the bed with a lamp burning beside her. Of course I was at once in her arms, and saw this only in a flash. But the picture, Psyche, a bed, and a lamp, is everlasting. And of course this speaks to the original myth as well as what's going to happen. When Psyche looks upon the god who is sleeping, or at the very least in bed, while holding a lamp, drips some oil onto the god, and then, of course, leads to her exile. And so we get a premonition here, a kind of vision of things to come. And this is not the first time that Lewis did this. Consider Jane, when sometimes she will hear something before she hears it. Or even Orual a little bit from now, when she's going up the mountain. And she hears in her psyche, I suppose, right? She hears in her soul. She hears in her heart, in her head. She hears, why should your heart not dance? And when she hears that, she starts fighting with herself, saying, why should it not dance? I'm miserable and all these terrible things are happening. I'm in a state of despair. Everything's wrong. The gods hate me. And then a little bit later, when she's talking to Psyche, Psyche asks the very same question. Why should our hearts not dance? And so Orual gets this foretaste of that which is yet to come. And in this conversation, Psyche goes on to say that essentially the priest was right to an extent, that there is a kind of devouring, there is an offering, there's also a marriage, she is a ransom, she's going to be eaten, she's going to be married. And so all of these things get wrapped up together. And I do think it's important that she says, there must be so much that neither the priest nor the fox knows. And so not only does the fox have a less than perfect understanding of things, but even the priest doesn't fully understand things. And so I think that this gives us a sense that the fox at his best in relying on reason, and the priest at his best relying on organized religion, are not necessarily bad as far as they go, but that both are pointing to something that can't be rationally comprehended. Now, Lewis is not against theology. he wrote an introduction to Athanasius's On the Incarnation, and he regularly talks about the importance of doing good theology. And so Lewis is not disconcerted with the talk of priest. He's not unconcerned with the talk of theology, but all of our articulations of theology, our confessions of faith, as important as they are still abstract ways of referring to concrete realities. Remember in Paralandra, where the C.S. Lewis character says to Ransom that, he can't put everything into words, all of his experience into words, because his experiences were so vague. And Ransom rebukes him and says, no, it's not my experiences that were vague. Things themselves are concrete. It's words that are vague, because words involve abstraction. We're getting away from that which is concrete, that which is solid, that which is substantial, that which is most real. And so there's something at play here that even the priest, even the fox cannot comprehend. And this is something that Psyche seems to have something of a natural relationship with. Now, in the same conversation, Psyche goes on to say some important things about death. This, she said, I have always, at least ever since I can remember, had a kind of longing for death. Psyche, I said, have I made you so little happy as that? No, she said. You don't understand. Not that kind of longing. It was when I was happiest that I longed most. It was on happy days when we were up there on the hills, the three of us, with the wind and the sunshine, where you couldn't see Glome or the palace. Do you remember? The color and the smell, and looking across at the gray mountain in the distance. And because it was so beautiful, it set me longing, always longing. Somewhere else, there must be more of it. Everything seemed to be saying, Psyche, come. But I couldn't, not yet, come, and I didn't know where I was to come to. It almost hurt me. I felt like a bird in a cage when the other birds of its kind are flying home. And Lewis himself talks about this in Surprised by Joy. This idea that he has a longing for death, not as some kind of depression, not like some kind of escape, but it's actually when things are at their best. Because when you are at the best, when you are most tasting goodness, the more you recognize that you aren't satisfied by earthly wraiths of goodness, but that what you want is the real thing. You want substance. You want that which shines through deep heaven and resides at the Empyrean, which is crossed only through death. As he talks about in Mere Christianity, that just as our thirst speaks to the reality of that which can quench our thirst, so too our desire for something that this earth can't offer speaks to the reality that we are made for something this earth can't offer. And so we see that playing out here in narrative form with Psyche, that it is when things were at their best that she most had this desire for a home to which she had never been. And I just love this. I think it's beautiful. And I think that it's most true when we are most self-aware of who we are, and when we have the best relationship with desire, with goodness, with pleasure. And remember in the old myth that it is the union of Psyche and Eros which produces pleasure. And so it is when our souls, when our psyche meets with love, that we are able to then produce pleasure, or out of that union of love with our soul, pleasure is born. And that pleasure itself summons us forth to an even higher reality in the great dance. And I just think there's something very beautiful and something very true about that. And then along this line of thought, she continues, the sweetest thing in all my life has been the longing to reach the mountain, to find the place where all the beauty came from, my country, the place where I ought to have been born. Do you think it all meant nothing, all the longing for home? For indeed it now feels, not like going, but like going back. All my life the god of the mountain has been wooing me. Oh, look up once, at least before the end, and wish me joy. I am going to my lover. Do you not see now? And so Psyche just beautifully expresses the fact that she's always desired her true home, the home that she's never been in, but the home where she will be most herself, the home where she will be most complete, the home that she's always been destined for. And she talks about wanting to reach the mountain, the place where all the beauty came from. And not only do I think that there is some clear Christian imagery coming in here, but we also see his Platonism coming in here. toward the end of Plato's dialogue, the Phaedo, Socrates gives us this myth, and he even calls it a myth within this dialogue, a myth about what ultimate reality is really like. And I talked about this in the introduction to the course, but it's worth rehashing here. He says that imagine that you lived your entire life in the ocean. It's murky, you can't really see very well, the colors seem rather drab for the most part, but eventually you're able to come up and live on the surface, you're able to live on the land. Well, now everything is a higher resolution. You see not through murky ocean, through murky water, but you see through clear air. Everything just seems more real, more clear, more vivid. You see colors that you only had an inkling of before, maybe even see new colors altogether. But the point is, everything is more real than what you once knew. Then he says, imagine that you look up at the big blue sky and what if that is just part of another ocean, and that if you were able to get up to the top, get above that ocean to something even more real, then you come to experience an even higher resolution. You see things more clearly. Things would be more beautiful, more good, even more fundamentally true. And maybe this would even be the realm of the gods. And so with this view in mind, this perspective in mind, where we live right now is something like the place of runoff from the mountain. And so all the beauty resides up on the mountain, and sometimes things kind of trickle down, but as they fall into our atmosphere, they become dim, they become dingy. But if we could follow those incomplete, those shadowy beauties up to their source, up to the mountain, well, then we would find the place where beauty actually comes from, the place where things are more real, more substantial. However, we'll never be able to go up the mountain unless we first are willing to forsake where we are here at sea level. And so I think that we see a lot of this Platonic imagery coming forth in the way that Psyche is framing this. And I think that is just absolutely beautiful. And now we're jumping ahead, and Psyche is talking about what happened on the mountain. The only thing that did me good, she continued, was quite different. It was hardly a thought, and very hard to put into words. There's a lot of the Fox's philosophy in it, things he says about gods or the divine nature, but mixed up with things the priest said too, about the blood and the earth and how sacrifice makes the crops grow. I'm not explaining it well. It seemed to come from somewhere deep inside me, deeper than the part that sees pictures of gold and amber palaces, deeper than fears and tears. It was shapeless, but you could just hold on to it, or just let it hold on to you. Then the change came. And so we see here that Psyche is transcending the fox, and she's transcending the priest. She's transcending philosophy, she's transcending articulated religion. She's moving into the things themselves. In fact, she's even moving on beyond these images that she's had in her head. She's moving beyond these desires, these good desires that she's had for her entire life. And now she's experiencing something like the thing itself. And for that reason, it is shapeless. It doesn't fit within her rational forms, her rational categories. And so she's lost any sense of trying to domesticate this reality. She's simply giving herself over to it. She is learning the right kind of submission. She is letting herself die. And in letting herself die, she's going to experience even more what it means to live. That's when the change comes. And more on Psyche next time. Now, Orual. Now, as I said, we're not actually going to spend a lot of time on Orual, just so you know. We'll get more on her next time when she, spoilers, gets a face, when she becomes more of a self. Now, after the sacrifice, she falls into a kind of madness. There is no escape from the gods into sleep or madness, for they can pursue you into them with dreams. Indeed, you are then most at their mercy. The nearest thing we have to defense against them, but there's no real defense, is to become very wide awake and sober and hard at work, to hear no music, and to look at earth or sky, and, above all, to love no one. And now, finding me heart-shattered for Psyche's sake, they made it the common burden of all my fantasies that Psyche was my greatest enemy. All my sense of intolerable wrong was directed against her. It was she who hated me. It was on her that I wanted to be revenged. And so Orual says that the nearest thing we have in defense against the gods is to be very wide awake and sober, hard at work, hear no music, and never to look at earth or sky. And above all, to love no one. And so the only way that she can defend herself against the gods is by closing in her context on herself. Never be willing to expansively give yourself away to anything. And we should be able to hear echoes of Screwtape here. Remember, what Screwtape never wanted his patient to do was to read a book that he enjoyed. Never to do anything that might broaden his context. He wants everything to be entirely self-referential, make him isolated, make him alone in the world. That's how you separate yourself away from the divine. And so what Orual proposes as a defense very much is the offense of Screwtape and Wormwood. And how sad this is, but also how common this is. As Kierkegaard says, it's the saddest thing of all for someone to live their entire life and to not discover that they need God. And I think that's absolutely true, and I think that we see that playing out for most of Book 1 with Orual. But then even more so, we see that she starts to envision Psyche as her greatest enemy, and that this plagues all of her dreams. And she thinks that this is just the gods playing some kind of cruel trick on her, but really what they're doing is revealing the fact that Orual is on the opposing side to Psyche, that she has made Psyche into her enemy. And a lot of the story is going to be Orual totally misunderstanding everything, right? She thinks she's a victim of the gods, but what the gods are trying to show her, what the gods are showing her, but she refuses to see, is that she has put herself at enmity with Psyche and with everything that makes Psyche good and lovable in any kind of rightly ordered sense. And so she has set herself against what is good. She has made Psyche her enemy. Remember what I talked about at the beginning, that a false love very much can be a more real form of hatred. And so she thinks that she loves Psyche, but in reality she does hate Psyche. She hates herself and she hates the gods. She hates everything, really, and she continually implodes because the divine nature is inescapable. And if you hate the divine, then you're going to end up hating everything. Existence itself is nested within a metaphysical reality, a divine reality. And eventually she decides to wear a veil that she's never going to take off. And so all these stories start to develop about her. She says that some of the women think that underneath the veil is something just absolutely hideous, or maybe even no face at all, maybe just an empty void. And then she says that the men thought that she was some kind of beauty so dazzling, and that's why she veiled her face, because people just wouldn't be able to resist her, or that Ungit would be jealous of her beauty. And so I just find this interesting here, that she thinks that that females are repulsed by her, and that men are drawn into her. And so on both sides, and who knows how much of this is true and how much of it is just Orual's own demented fantasies of sorts. But I think that what this shows us is that she has for one thing, she's too concerned about what people think of her, but also that she has a over-identification with the masculine, and that she has emptied herself of the feminine. She has become nothing to the females and everything to the males. And I think that just speaks to her generally disordered psyche. Now, as we jump forward in time and we get this overview of her queenship, which actually was pretty productive, right? She ruled well as a queen. She made the mines profitable. She fixed the infrastructure. She fixed up the palace. She did all these good administrative things. And I think that can be used to Orual's credit. At the same time, all the focus is on these governmental things that she did, and it very much makes me think of the kinds of books that used to Scrub like to read, right? That he loved to read about, taxes and drains, but his books were very weak on dragons. Well, it kind of seems like Orual, despite the fact that, on a practical level, on a literal level, she's doing things that a queen should do, but the fact that everything that she's doing is very just administrative, to me speaks to what Lewis might say as being very much grown up in all of the wrong ways. She doesn't have any real relationships. She doesn't have any real wonder about her. It's all just practical. It's pragmatic. It's administrative. And so even though she's doing things that a queen should do, I don't think that Lewis is trying to frame this in a very positive light, given what he says elsewhere. Now, toward the end of book 1, she goes on this trip and she encounters this priest of Istra. Now, I don't know about you, but when I first read this, something just lit up in my heart, in my mind, just questioning what is going on here. And it just seemed so exciting, like I was on the edge of a mystery. And so I hope that you got some sense of that as well. But she hears this story from the priest. And it's obviously related to her life and what happened with Psyche, but things are just kind of off, at least as far as Orual understands it. Perhaps most importantly, the priest says that Psyche's sisters saw the palace, but then ruined her life simply out of jealousy. And Orual lashes out against this because, for one hand, she did not see the palace, and if she saw the palace, then there wouldn't be any kind of riddle, right? Things would just be really clear, and that there wouldn't be any kind of mystery, no questions about this. Surely, if she saw the palace, well, she would believe it. But no, that didn't happen. But in fact, it actually did, as we're about to see. And also, I mean, she wasn't jealous, right? She loved Psyche. And so she says that surely the Psyche's sisters would have some more to say about that. The priest says, yeah, the jealous always do. And so this is what launches Orual off to write Book 1 as this indictment against the gods, because they fed this lying myth, supposedly lying myth, into the mind of this priest. And so they're spreading false tales, continuing to make her into a victim. However, as we know by this point, the gods very much have more truth on their side than Orual does, because she did in fact see the palace. And so looking back, when I lifted my head and looked once more into the mist across the water, I saw that which brought my heart into my throat. There stood the palace, grey, as all things were grey in that hour and place, but solid and motionless, wall within wall, pillar and arch and architrave, acres of it, a labyrinth beauty. As she has said, it was like no house ever seen in our land or age. Pinnacles and buttresses leaped up. No memories of mine, you would think, could help me to imagine them. Unbelievably tall and slender, pointed and prickly, as if stone were shooting out into branch and flower. No light showed from any window. It was a house asleep, and somewhere within it, asleep also, someone or something. How holy, or horrible, or beautiful, or strange, with Psyche in its arms. And I, what had I done and said? What would it do to me for my blasphemies and unbelievings? I never doubted that I must now cross the river, or try to cross it, even if it should drown me. I must lie on the steps at that great gate of that house, and make my petition. I must ask forgiveness of Psyche as well as of the god. I had dared to scold her, dared, what was worse, to try to comfort her as a child, but all the time she was far above me, herself now hardly mortal. If what I saw was real, I was in great fear. Perhaps it was not real. I looked and looked to see if it would not fade or change. Then, as I rose, for all this time I was still kneeling where I had drunk, almost before I stood on my feet, the whole thing was vanished. There was a tiny space of time in which I thought I could see how some swirlings of the mist had looked, for the moment, like towers and walls, but very soon no likeness at all. I was staring simply into fog, and my eyes smarting with it. And so, as the priest said, she did indeed see the palace. And I think that's very much worth noting here, that she saw the palace when she was kneeling. It was when she was in a posture of submission that she was able to see the home of the gods. She was able to see the reality in which Psyche lived, this world of love, of Eros, of Cupid, this world of Venus, that this is a world that you can only experience when you are laying yourself down, you're giving yourself over. And so it was when she was kneeling that she was able to see the palace. Once she stands back up in the power of her own feet, well, now she can no longer see it. It fades away, and she starts to convince herself that it wasn't real, it was an illusion. She starts to see it as a dream of sorts, and that for that reason she dismisses it. And that makes me think of a line from George MacDonald's The Princess and the Goblin, which I'm currently reading. And I won't spend too much time on this because it's kind of a small point, but I think it still connects to this pretty well. This princess has gone up a couple times now into the upper kind of forgotten rooms of her castle, of her palace, and she stumbles across her great-great-great-grandmother who's there, who obviously is some kind of mystical figure, and she can only find her when she wants to be found, and so it very much has this dreamlike quality to it. And in fact, the girl herself, when she's out about in the daytime, sometimes she's kind of convinced herself that maybe this great-great-great-grandmother of hers, it was, in fact, a dream. But eventually she finds her again, and her grandmother says that she would have found her sooner if she hadn't convinced herself that it was a dream. And I think that that short little part of that story speaks to a broader narrative in Till We Have Faces, that Orual is going to have another encounter with this world that Psyche stands for, but she would have found it a lot sooner if she hadn't convinced herself that it was a dream, if she had embraced the reality as it is. She hadn't given herself over to abstraction and to rational thought as a smokescreen for dealing with the actual reality that was right before her. Now, after Psyche commits the transgression against the god, Orual experiences, or sees at least, the aftermath in the mountain. And as if it weren't enough that Orual saw the palace, she also saw the god himself in the aftermath of Psyche's transgression. There came, as it were, a lightning that endured. That is, the look of it was the look of lightning, pale, dazzling, without warmth or comfort, showing each smallest thing with fierce distinctness. But it did not go away. This great light stood over me, as still as a candle burning in a curtained and shuttered room. In the center of the light was something like a man. It is strange that I cannot tell you its size. Its face was far above me, yet memory does not show the shape as a giant's, and I do not know whether it stood, or seemed to stand, on the far side of the water, or on the water itself. Though this light stood motionless, my glimpse of the face was as swift as a true flash of lightning. I could not bear it for longer. Not my eyes only, but my heart and blood and very brain were too weak for that. A monster, the shadow brute that I and all Glome had imagined, would have subdued me less than the beauty this face wore. And this description that we get here of the god of the mountain reminded me of a couple things. First of all, from the Consolation of Philosophy, which was very important to Lewis. And first regarding the size issue, she says, its face was far above me, yet memory does not show the shape as a giant's. And so there's a sense that it's not really clear where he's spatially positioned here, or even how big he is. That he seems huge, but also he doesn't seem like a giant. And so it's not really clear what space he's occupying. And that reminded me of the description of Lady Philosophy in Boethius's The Consolation of Philosophy, which is a medieval text that's very important for Lewis. And so this comes from Boethius's The Consolation of Philosophy. While I was pondering thus in silence, and using my pen to set down so tearful a complaint, there appeared standing over my head a woman's form, whose countenance was full of majesty, whose eyes shone as with fire, and in power of insight surpassed the eyes of men, whose color was full of life, whose strength was yet intact, though she was so full of years, that none would ever think that she was subject to such age as ours. One could but doubt her varying stature, for at one moment she repressed it to the common measure of a man, at another she seemed to touch with her crown the very heavens, and when she had raised higher her head, it pierced even the sky and baffled the sight of those who would look upon it. And so this speaks to immanence and transcendence. And for Boethius, it is the wisdom that instantiates itself in the particular that we can actually engage with before us, but it also transcends the particular and moves upward into the heavens that we can't possibly comprehend. And so it is this staircase, it is this ladder, or it is this connecting point between in the great chain of being that reaches down to where we are, but also reaches up to that which we most desire. And I think something very similar is happening here with the god of the mountain, which stands for love in its most divine nature. Love is that which unites earth with heaven. And so on one hand, he seems to be the size of a man, but also he seems to be the size of a giant without appearing giantish. And so he is this connecting rod between heaven and earth. That's what love is, and that's what wisdom is. And in fact, to even continue with some of these connections with the Consolation of Philosophy, in the Consolation, you have Boethius, this man who is falsely imprisoned, awaiting his execution, and it starts off with him lamenting the fact that Providence does not seem to be working in his favor. Right? He feels like he's done all the right things, but now here he is a kind of victim. And so part of the Consolation of Philosophy, and in fact a major part of that narrative, is Boethius coming to terms with God, coming to terms with providence, going from feeling like a victim to learning how to rightly relate himself to the providence that has been dealt to him, just as Orual is obviously doing throughout Till We Have Faces. And so whether Lewis is doing something very intentional here, or if this is just part of his thought, like I said, Boethius is very important for Lewis, and so maybe whether this is intentional parallel or it's more of just the way Lewis is thinking coming out here through his fiction, I think that there are some comparisons to be made here between Till We Have Faces and the Consolation of Philosophy. Now, this last part where she talks about how she'd rather have a monster, right? She'd rather have a shadow brute than to behold such radical beauty that was just overwhelming and really shaming in comparison. That reminded me of when Gimli is leaving Lothlorien, thinking about the fact that now he's been severed from Galadriel, this symbol of great beauty and grace that he has become so devoted to. And so he says, "Torment in the dark was the danger that I feared, and it did not hold me back. But I would not have come had I known the danger of light and joy. Now I have taken my worst wound in this parting, even if I were to go this night straight to the Dark Lord. Alas for Gimli, son of Glóin." So Gimli says that he'd rather have the Dark Lord than to have experienced this great beauty that now he has seemed to have lost. And so that's not exactly a one-for-one comparison, but there's kind of a rhyming theme here that the overwhelming goodness of true beauty humbles us. It gives us a sense of heartache, a sense of desire for that which can never be ours, that even radical monstrosities can't necessarily rival. Part of conversion, part of redemption, part of transformation is actually letting beauty slay you, giving yourself over to this power that you can never have for yourself, that you can never comprehend, and giving yourself over to beauty and giving yourself over to love. You yourself might actually find that you become beautiful, that you become love, that the consuming and the loving are one and the same. And that is where we will leave off for now. Until next time, Godspeed. All right, thank you for listening or watching if you're over on YouTube. As a reminder, we do have 3 Mythic Mind podcasts, and so make sure you're subscribed to this one, to Mythic Mind Games, and Mythic Mind Movies and Shows, where we're continuing with a Star Wars series that's going to take us through the end of this year. Or also, you can subscribe to my YouTube channel, and you can watch the video for all of those over there. Now, before we go, I would like to thank all my patrons and all Tier 3 patrons by name. So many thanks to Mark, William, Paul, Clinton, Jamie, Christopher, Justin, Aaron, Chaz, Evie, Kyle, Tyler, Chase, David, Amanda, Justin, Roger, Jack, Ross, Don, Adam, Kit, and Andrew. And to all of my currently 80 paid patrons. You all do so much in helping me to keep on doing things like this, and as well as all the other ventures that we're going on with Mythic Mind. If you enjoy this content and you want to become part of what we're doing, whether you're a silent supporter or you're an active participant, then I welcome you to head over to patreon.com/mythicmind, become a patron. Any level of support is helpful and will get you on the inside here. You can join our Discord server, join some of our episode chats. You can get all 3 podcasts delivered into a single feed, early and ad-free. So again, just become a patron at patreon.com/mythicmind. Become a Tier 3 patron if you would like to join us for the Elder Scrolls and philosophy. But that's it for now. The next thing to be coming up from Mythic Mind, if you're listening on the free feeds, will be over on Mythic Mind Games this Friday with our conversation on Final Fantasy V. And so hopefully you'll hear from me then. Until next time, Godspeed.